Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I have no conflicts of interest to declare. I received funding from the NIH and the Thoracic Society Foundation. So, sort of that mandatory slide whenever we're giving a Dyssynchrony talk, paralytics may improve survival in patients with severe ARDS, and I emphasize may based on a subsequent talk during this lecture from Taylor Thompson. While I think the CureAssist trial, this multi-center randomized trial suggesting mortality benefit with Dyssynchrony demonstrated a lot of enthusiasm, I think there's this lingering nagging question of why, how might this be biologically plausible? And I think there was a clue in the secondary outcomes of this paper, looking at the incidence of barotrauma and pneumothorax specifically in patients randomized to Dyssynchrony versus placebo. It turns out that the incidence of gross barotrauma or pneumothorax detected on a radiograph was halved among patients who were paralyzed. And I think this was a somewhat surprising finding, given that the study was very regimented in terms of the ventilator protocols used. So in both study arms, patients received volume assist controlled ventilation, receiving a preset tidal volume of around 6 cc's per kilo, received the same low PEEP strategy, and had plateau pressures that we would consider on the lower side, certainly not up around 30 on average. And so what then might be the biological plausibility for this? Well, if we're saying they're already receiving lung protective ventilation, their tidal volumes look low, the plateau pressures were low, and yet somehow paralyzing those patients prevents gross barotrauma, prevents clinically apparent lung injury. How might that occur? And I think it has to do with simply a misunderstanding of how ventilators work that's sort of ingrained in our language as intensivists and respiratory therapists. The biological plausibility, I would say, is that the volume delivered by the ventilator actually exceeds the preset tidal volume. And this is probably what was going on in this trial. And oftentimes you'll pick up overview articles before these phenomena were recognized, and they'll say, well, that's exactly why you should use volume assist control, because then you know the patient's getting 6 cc's per kilo. But I think that's a misconception of how volume assist control works. So it's actually factually inaccurate. It's incorrect to say that the clinician is setting the tidal volume on the ventilator, even though that's what that knob is called. I guess ventilators don't have knobs anymore. That's what that dial is called, is the tidal volume. That's not actually what it is. All it is the inspiratory cycle volume. The difference being that the ventilator doesn't then turn into a vacuum and suck that volume back out. It's only pushing air in. It's not sucking it back out. And by nature, with assist control, the assist portion of it means that the patient can trigger the ventilator. The patient can determine the timing of those inspiratory cycles. And so if the patient initiates 2 inspiratory cycles without completely exhaling in between them, then their cumulative volume change from those 2 inspiratory cycles will be higher. So the patient will see a tidal volume, if you will, that's higher than what the ventilator says the tidal volume is the patient's getting. And so that phenomenon is called breath stacking dyssynchrony. So that's defined as consecutive ventilator inspiratory cycles with incomplete exhalation between them. It's something we see all the time if you just start to stare at these ventilator waveforms. This is a flow waveform here, where you can see a patient had an inspiratory cycle, over here on the left, had only a brief exhalation, and then triggered another inspiratory cycle. And so the cumulative volume change is this minus the little bit exhaled plus another inspiratory cycle. And so if you integrate this flow waveform, which the ventilator does not do correctly, you'll see this pattern. And so the idea of breath stacking literally means that you had 2 inspiratory cycles stacked on top of each other. The way that any ventilator, at least that I've ever used, handles this is they're designed to measure inspiratory cycle volume, and the volume resets to 0 every time there's a new inspiratory cycle. So if you actually pull up the volume waveform on the ventilator, it will not look like this, even though this is what's happening to the patient. I think it's a really big problem. So if you look at this over time, you'll find that sure enough, whenever this phenomenon seems to happen, if you're actually measuring the volume change is roughly double the preset tidal volume. So if you have patients managed at around 6 cc per kilo, when this is happening, they are getting the same exposure as the control arm of our breath. And obviously, they're not all patients do this every breath, but at the times that they do it, the equivalent stretch that they experience in the lungs is the same as the high tidal volume strategy in the original ARDS trial. So what are sort of data to suggest that, further supporting data to suggest that this really is an issue, that this is causing occult high stretch? Well, if you look at these waveforms we reported, patients where we have esophageal manometry and transpulmonary pressure as well, you can see I highlighted in orange there the first, a non-stacked breath here. And the peak pressures, this patient was receiving pressure-regulated volume control, I believe. Peak pressures were about 28 to 30. The plateau pressure was about the same, 28. And that resulted in a transpulmonary pressure at inspiration of about 11. And as a frame of reference, transpulmonary pressure at total lung capacity in a healthy person is about 25. So it gives you a sense of sort of the maximum amount of stretch that the lungs experience in normal life would be about a transpulmonary pressure of 25. So 11 is perhaps somewhat elevated, but not all that high. Now contrast that in the same patient where we did a plateau hold now right after the stack breath. So here's the first inspiratory cycle. Patient exhales, and then we did a plateau hold here. And you can see even before we get to that maneuver, if you just look at the fluctuations in transpulmonary pressure, you can see for the first breath of the stacked pair, transpulmonary pressure was low, then it more than doubles. Then it's low, then it more than doubles. Then it's low, then it more than doubles. Because there's incomplete exhalation in the flow tracings of each breath. And so if we look specifically at that plateau hold, you can see that plateau pressure was about 35 and the transpulmonary pressure was 23. So while this patient, by objective measures in ARDS and probably what was documented in the Curasis trial, had a plateau pressure in the mid-20s or upper 20s, when you actually looked at the true exposure this patient was getting, they were stretching their lung to the equivalent of TLC, total lung capacity, every time they had a stacked breath. And in this particular patient, that was every single time. So it's easy to imagine if a patient's doing this often enough that this might result in clinically relevant lung injury. So, but importantly, not every patient does this all the time. So this is a bit of a confusing plot, but essentially on the y-axis here we have the cumulative incidence, and the x-axis is the frequency of stacked breaths. So you can see the large majority of patients had a relatively low frequency of stacked breaths during a 72-hour recording. So the first 72 hours of ARDS is going to be around the trial. But if you look at this subgroup of patients, there's a handful of patients that averaged 200 to 300, in some cases even 600 or 700 stacked breaths an hour for the entire 72 hours of the recorded waveforms. So if something like the Rose trial is negative, perhaps it was because it failed to account for these differences in patients. It'd be very easy to imagine how patients who have 600 or 700 stacked breaths, 600 or 700 high tidal volumes every hour for a full 72 hours would get clinically significant lung injury, whereas patients that are doing it less frequently, maybe they don't benefit from paralysis. So, just as sort of proof of principle, indeed, when this phenomenon happens, after a patient gets paralyzed, breath stacking goes completely away. So without changing anything on the ventilator, the patient in volume assist control, paralyzing the patient changes the tidal volume in volume assist control for patients that are exhibiting breath stacking. So, but importantly, sedation does not always eliminate breath stacking. So this is data out of the University of Chicago, where they looked at sedation management in patients who had clinically apparent breath stacking at the bedside, and evaluated patients who received an intervention that was focused on additional boluses of sedative or analgesics. And while on average there was some decrease in breath stacking, it certainly wasn't true in everybody. And so you can see here, this is a patient who, if anything, actually had increased incidence of breath stacking. And was not fully abated just with deeper sedation. So I don't think sedation alone is the answer. Additionally, again, out of the University of Chicago, some of the work has suggested that the preset tidal volume may influence breath stacking. And this, I think, was something that was probably recognized, at least indirectly, in the original ARDSNet trial. So as Bob or Taylor will tell you, while that trial was ongoing, they passed an amendment to the protocol called the sucking wind amendment, where they noticed that when patients were managed on 6 cc per kilo, some of them just did not like it. And so the protocol allowed for a slight increase in tidal volume up to as much as 8 cc's per kilo in patients who were profoundly uncomfortable, which is probably patient ventilator asynchronous. And so what the Chicago study suggests is that patients with lower tidal volumes, probably because also not only is the tidal volume lower, but the inspiratory time potentially would be shorter, patients with lower tidal volumes are predisposed to more frequent breath stacking as well. So the converse of that would be, is it possible that increasing the tidal volume enough might eliminate breath stacking and therefore decrease the true volume exposure that the patient gets. So, as the previous speaker touched on, there are at least two, probably more than that, breath stacking subtypes. And I think it's important to review them because the way that they get managed might be fundamentally different. So the first is this phenomenon of double triggering. And often in the literature, people will use the terms double triggering and breath stacking as synonymous with each other. But I think it's worth distinguishing between them. So double triggering refers to a particular mechanism where you have one sustained patient inspiratory effort that triggers 2 breaths. So it's intuitively defined, right? Double triggering, one effort gives you 2 breaths. And you can see that on these waveforms here, where you have a sustained negative deflection, so negative pleural pressure, while the patient's breathing in. And during that sustained inspiration, the patient's able to trigger a first ventilatory cycle. The patient continues to make a sustained inspiratory effort, and triggers a second inspiratory cycle. So with one sustained inspiratory effort, the patient has 2 inspiratory cycles or stacked breaths. And so this double triggering phenomenon, I think, is likely to be respiratory phenomenon. This is something that is most likely influenced by all the factors that we think that contribute to respiratory drive. So that's pain, anxiety, discomfort, things like acidemia or hypercapnia as well might influence ventilatory drive. And presumably, if it's a ventilatory drive phenomenon, it's also relatively irregular or erratic, just like the way that you and I normally breathe. We don't breathe in a very stereotyped pattern. Our breaths are different with every single breath, and also never at exactly the same time. And so contrast that, if you will, with reverse triggering. So here, we'll just briefly go through the waveform. So here is a machine inspiratory cycle. So there's no negative deflection in esophageal pressure. So machine inspiratory cycle. And then towards the end of that inspiratory cycle, suddenly the patient makes an inspiratory effort that triggers a second machine cycle. So it's machine breath followed by patient-initiated breath, as opposed to 2 patient-initiated breaths. That's sort of a clue that you can see this going on at the bedside. So if you ignore the waveforms for a second, as a previous speaker touched on, we think that this is probably a primitive neuromechanical reflex. It might actually be preserved biologically across species as part of the fight or flight response. So it's been described in several other mammalian species, including cats and horses. Go into a deep dive of physiology literature. And the reason we think this would happen is that it's energetically efficient. If an animal is trying to run away from a predator, it's most energetically efficient to synchronize your breathing to the very rhythmic pattern of running. So if you just close your eyes and listen to what running sounds like, it is very rhythmic and stereotyped. It's very pattern generated. And what this entrainment phenomenon is that results in reverse triggering is a similar idea. It's a very rhythmic pattern that matches what the ventilator is doing. And as I believe one of our 2 hosts for this afternoon described, this phenomenon also happens in deeply sedated patients in the OR before they get paralyzed. And it's also been described in the sleep literature as well, when patients are sleeping. In the ARDS literature, though, where this results in reverse triggering, is that it seems that, particularly in patients who are critically ill, there might be a phase delay, if you will, in that neuromechanical reflex. So instead of the kinetic stimulus of running, the kinetic stimulus that the patient is getting is a very rhythmic stretching of the lungs from the ventilator, but still a sort of a tactile, if you will, stimulus that the body is experiencing. And so the body would then synchronize its respiratory pattern to that in a very repetitive nature. And so we think this is potentially a neuromechanical reflex that would respond very differently to therapies. So as an example of how that might work, so this is a patient who had a substantial breath stacking dyssynchrony here, as you can see. The arrows mark machine-initiated breaths. You can see there's an entrainment phenomenon that doesn't always trigger the ventilator. So this patient has machine breath, then an effort that doesn't trigger the ventilator, but occasionally that delayed effort will indeed trigger the ventilator. So we performed a radical intervention that you can all do that immediately, instantaneously eliminated this phenomenon. And that radical intervention was turning off one of the 2 rhythm generators. We just turned off the respiratory rate on the ventilator. So this patient is still on volume assist control. We took the respiratory rate that was preset, turned it down to 1, and immediately the patient was perfectly synchronous with the ventilator. And I think this really highlights that you wouldn't expect that at all if this were double triggering, if this were a respiratory drive phenomenon. And so I think by decreasing the respiratory rate, you actually decrease the tidal volume that the patient was getting. And so this is an example of, sort of, again, our lay language being completely representative of what's going on. This is actually an example of the ventilator overbreathing the patient, right? You took off the ventilator, suddenly the patient was just fine, had a reasonable respiratory rate, and had perfect synchrony on the ventilator afterwards. Also highlighting how sort of primitive of a reflex this is. So it's been described in, as I mentioned, comatose patients, sleeping patients, and also in legally brain-dead patients, where they came back after the brain death exam and found that the patient was triggering the ventilator with the reverse triggering in a case series published in Blue. So there's more to come with this. I know the title of the talk was focused in part on the clinical relevance, or the extent to which this causes ventilation-induced lung injury. So the ROSE trial, the Penal Networks trial of cisatracurium versus placebo finished. And within that, a subgroup of sites actually recorded continuous ventilator waveforms for the first 72 hours. So while we haven't finished the analysis yet, stay tuned. Hopefully later this summer or this fall, we'll have data within that clinical trial looking at the incidence of breast stacking dyssynchrony or true tidal volume exposure more generally, and whether or not that explains some of the findings of the trial. So in conclusion, or a rational conclusion, some of the things we've covered today is that volume control doesn't control the tidal volume. And that's true for all breast stacking dyssynchrony. Increasing the set tidal volume may decrease the tidal volume. It's true for double triggering. Lowering the respiratory rate may lower the tidal volume. It's certainly true for reverse triggering. Deeper sedation may increase the tidal volume to the extent that it exacerbates reverse triggering. And brain-dead patients can make spontaneous breathing efforts. It's one to have your trainees chew on for a moment. So in conclusion, otherwise, I think there's obvious clinical relevance to breast stacking dyssynchrony. One is that certainly in a subset of patients who do it often enough, there probably is ventilation-induced lung injury that resolves. It's probably not true of all patients. Certainly one high-volume breath doesn't do it, but in a subset of patients at least have it frequently enough, it's easy to imagine they're causing lung injury. Second, I think this is really an opportunity to individualize sedation management, especially as we start to understand more about the different subphenotypes of breast stacking. With the possibility that something like a respiratory drive-related double triggering might be quite responsive to opiates, for instance, in particular, that blunt respiratory drive, whereas something like reverse triggering might be exacerbated by suppressing consciousness. And lastly, I think there's an opportunity here, ultimately, to figure out how to individualize neuromuscular blockade to precision. Thank you very much.